Hi, everybody. Welcome to Notes 4.3. And this is going to be our last set of notes before the EOC or the AIR test. And today we are talking about state governments and the Ohio constitutions. And yes, that's constitutions. We've actually had more than one. Now, the reason we are talking about this is that state governments have just as much of an impact on your life as the national government does, right? We have a system of federalism, which we'll talk about in a second, that allows us to get involved at multiple levels of government. So, that being said, here are our learning objectives. We are reviewing the concept of federalism, describing the structure of Ohio's government, and explaining how the Ohio Constitution of 1851 fixed problems that Ohio faced under its original constitution. So let's start out with federalism. Federalism, if you remember back all the way to Unit 1, is the division of power between national, state, and local governments. Now, if you remember even further, those different powers have different names, right? We have enumerated powers, powers that are given to the national government only, right? States don't have enumerated powers, they don't share these powers. This is only given to the national government. So, for example, we have declaring war, regulating interstate commerce or trade. Those are powers given specifically to the national government. And in these instances, both of these are powers of Congress. Then we have reserved powers, and those are powers held by the states only. The national government does not have these powers, and these are outlined in the 10th Amendment. These are things like education, driving laws, marriage licenses, right? Things that vary from state to state are reserved powers. And then you have concurrent powers, and these are powers that are shared by both the national and state government. So they happen at the same time concurrently. And our biggest example here is going to be taxes, right? You pay federal taxes, state taxes, and local taxes as well. So remember that our kind of visual of federalism is going to be this Venn diagram. Right, you've got powers that are only given to the national and states. Those are your outside circles. And then where they overlap, those are your concurrent or shared powers. Now, Ohio's government reflects a similar setup of the national government, right? Like these 50 states, yes, they have their own powers. However, most of them do reflect the same setup of the national government. Most of them have separation of powers, including Ohio. There are three branches. And there are checks and balances between those branches as well, just like we see in the national government. The Ohio Constitution creates the structure of Ohio's government. It's going to outline what that is and establishes rights and protections for citizens of Ohio specifically. And when we're talking about principles of government, this is going to be an example of limited government, right? Because it's outlining what it is that the state of Ohio and the government of Ohio can and cannot do in regards to the rights of citizens. So let's get into the structure of the Ohio government. And you guys should see some parallels or similarities between Ohio's government and the US federal government that we've been talking about in our class so far. So let's start with the General Assembly. The General Assembly's national equivalent is Congress. So these two pieces here, the General Assembly and Congress, are the legislative branches. The General Assembly is for Ohio, Congress for the national government. Traditionally, the General Assembly is the most powerful branch in Ohio, and it's broken into two pieces or houses. You have a House of Reps and a Senate. So that should sound very, very familiar to you because that is how Congress is also set up. And the General Assembly does the same thing as Congress, except for at the state level. They are responsible for making state laws. And the General Assembly is voted into office by citizens of Ohio. So we do have some popular sovereignty in here as well. And then this is just a picture of the Capitol building where the General Assembly meets. All right, let's talk about the governor. We have seen quite a bit of him in these last couple of months with COVID. So, the governor's national equivalent is the president. The governor is the head of the executive branch of the state, just like the president is the head of the executive branch of the federal government. Just like the president, they are limited to 2 4-year terms. And they command the National Guard. So the National Guard is kind of like the state military. So just like the president, again, I told you guys you'd see quite a few parallels. Just like the president is commander in chief of the armed forces, the governor commands the National Guard of the state. The governor is also going to write and propose the state budget. And just like the president of the national government, the governor can veto laws and they can also pardon offenders, just like we see the president able to do. Now, there are other important executive officials. I just felt like it was important for you guys to hear who these people are because they pop up and they're on ballots and things like that. So, you have the Secretary of State, and yes, you do have you have one at the national level, but in Ohio, the Secretary of State is going to oversee elections and run elections. We have an Ohio Attorney General, and that is our state's chief lawyer. So if Ohio were to go to court, this Attorney General would represent them. We have a treasurer who handles the state's money. We have a state auditor who makes sure that work is being done efficiently. So I don't have an example of the state auditor, but if you, or the next time you go fill up your gas tank, take a look at the gas. It'll probably have a sticker on it that said, this has been inspected and approved by Dusty Rhodes, Hamilton County Auditor, right? Their job is basically just to make sure that things are getting done honestly and efficiently. And then the superintendent of education oversees state public schools. So, right, like at our building, Mr. Hunt oversees our school. Mr. Brandt is our superintendent, who is Mr. Hunt's boss and oversees our district. And then there is a superintendent of education at the state level that oversees all schools and all districts in the state of Ohio. And then we have the court system, and the national equivalent there is the Supreme Court and the judicial branch. And in our original Constitution, which we'll get to in just a second, these justices were appointed by the General Assembly, or that legislative branch of Ohio. They were not voted in by the public. That has changed as a result of Ohio's Constitution from 1851. And now justices at the Ohio level are publicly elected. And just like the national level, they can be impeached. And I just want to point out a difference between like our state Supreme Court. That is our highest court in the state. It cannot go any further except to the US Supreme Court if the decision is going to be appealed. So, and that is the case for all of the 50 states. So, state Supreme Courts are the highest court in the state, and the only court higher is going to be the federal or US Supreme Court. All right, so let's talk about these constitutions here. We've had two in our history. We've had one that should say 1803. That is a typo on my end. But the very first constitution from 1803, as I've mentioned before, set up the same structure as our federal government with 3 branches and checks and balances between them, established basic rights and liberties for people of Ohio, and is ultimately what allowed Ohio to become a state and be admitted into the Union. And then we have the Ohio Constitution of 1851, which is the Constitution that we have today. And that was written because Ohio was growing. It was literally getting bigger. There were more people, and there were some issues that needed to be fixed. So we needed a better document. And this Constitution provided for a more balanced power between the branches. So I mentioned that the General Assembly was and still largely is the most powerful branch, but it's going to lose some of its power under this new Constitution. So on the left side here, I have listed out all of the problems under the Ohio Constitution of 1803. And then on the right, how the Ohio 1851 Constitution fixed those problems. So let's start out here first. The legislative branch under the original Constitution, the General Assembly, had too much power, as I mentioned, and the governor, that executive, didn't have enough. And on top of that, elected leaders were appointed, not voted in by the people. So this led to quite a bit of corruption and overall feelings that, the people needed to have a voice. So in 1851, under the new Constitution, Ohio citizens were now able to vote for their leaders, and limits or checks were placed on that General Assembly. So it's going to weaken the legislative branch of Ohio. And when we're looking at this, right, we can see that our founders of this newer constitution were thinking about popular sovereignty and limited government, right? The people having a voice and giving those in power their authority, and then limiting what the government can and cannot do. Second, the second problem under the first Ohio Constitution was that the Ohio Supreme Court had to meet in every county. So there wasn't a way for them to break down the work. If there was an issue in every county, they had to travel to every county. And I know Ohio has changed over time, but there are like 80 counties. So there were not enough courts. So in 1851, the new Constitution added district courts to lighten the burden on the state Supreme Court. So those district courts spread out various parts of Ohio. So some counties are a part of a certain district. So it's a way to lighten the burden on the state Supreme Court so that way they don't have to travel to every single county every time there is an issue that they needed to hear. And then finally, Ohio was in significant debt under the first Constitution, like a lot of debt. So in the 1851 Constitution, the debt limitations were put into place, and there were also limits put into place for state spending and borrowing that had not been put into place before. And that was a way to try and fix that debt and get us out of that hole that we had put ourselves in. Alrighty, guys, that was the last set of notes before the air test. So remember, your learning objectives were to review federalism, describe the structure of Ohio's government, and explain how the Ohio Constitution of 1851 fixed problems that Ohio faced under its original constitution. So make sure that you go back if you need to and get in any blanks, and let me know if you guys have any questions. Thanks for watching. See you later.